Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's continue with Trump and with his peace plan. And according to information we have, Trump will focus on stopping the war rather than enabling Ukraine to gain back territories. That was stated by BBC, and according to BBC they were citing the official sources from the Trump administration. Crimea is no more. The return of peninsula to Ukraine is unrealistic, BBC citing Trump's new advisor. Brian Lanza says that new presidential administration will focus solely on the achieving peace, not on reclaiming lost territories. Zelensky must show us realistic negotiation plan. If he insists on occupied territories, we will not take it seriously or support it. This is very important because without even any decision or any idea or any, conclusions from the president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, first the United States of America need to solve their issues with Zelensky, with the president of Ukraine. Because, for example, we have a lot of bloggers from the territory Ukraine who provide us very interesting and detailed information about the status, not of the situation along the combat contact, but about people and among the society. And for example, some Ukrainian sources are saying that there is a very deep feeling in Ukraine that in order for there to be peace, Zelensky must be gone. Don't misunderstand me, the Ukraine blogger writes. I'm not saying people want him gone, but more realistic, more realize that Zelensky will fight even with women and children if he has to. Also, he stated and added that the wife of a very senior officer in the Ukraine army, Drone Corps, also told me that Syrsky, according to her husband, is also completely crazy and he has similar beliefs to Zelensky. So this is the most important thing, that it's very far to start discussion and negotiation process between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. First, the United States of America need to find a solution how to force Zelensky and Syrsky to follow the same plan. And you know that as in previous post was stated, that Syrsky is very crazy, and more people in Ukraine understand that it's going to be very difficult to begin the peace negotiation with these two people. And maybe this is the reason that about 20% of the Ukraine armed forces military deserted from the battlefield. At least that was stated by The Economist. And of course, from one side we see a lot of steps that were made by Trump to start peace negotiations and so on. But as for the United States itself, for example, today we received report that Rapcon USA has been awarded a $435 billion contract to build a new TNT production plant in Kentucky. The contract represents the Army's attempts to revive domestic TNT production for the first time in several decades. So we see that from one side, the United States of America is seeking the peace path, but on the other side, we see that continue militarization of its own country. And furthermore, we got additional report that as a president, Donald Trump would use his signature blend of Belgrade threats and friendly overtures, aiming to disrupt the deepening partnership between Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. This is the main strategy, rivals of the United States. That was stated by The Hill. So while there is a very interesting and very tricky political games, let's discuss the situation on the ground, because during the previous night we got lots of changes on the ground. And first let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continued their offensive operation. According to NATO mappers, the Russians during the previous night managed to improve their positions in the northern direction from the village of Maximovka. So these fields and these trenches on the fortifications and former farms probably were captured by the Russians during the previous 12 hours. Furthermore, we have a significant progress of the Russians in the fields. If you remember, just yesterday we were talking that the Russians began their outflanking operation from Maximilianovka in the southwestern direction with the purpose to answer the village of Dalne. So this is the road of Russian attack, and the main idea of this attack is not just to cut this territory in two along the 0510 road. The most important for the Russians in this case is to force the Ukrainians that are currently located in these fields to retreat and to fall back first towards the village of Sukhiye Yale and then further in the northwestern direction. And during the previous 24 hours, most likely the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to do this, at least from these fields and from these fields. Now let's compare the map. For example, this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 9th of November, and this is the situation on the ground by the beginning of the 10th of November. The Russians managed to take under control these fields and to force the Ukrainians to fall back on these fields. And we see that the Russians are shortening the lines, and we need to expect that in the very near future the Russians will be able to connect their positions in the vicinity of Dalny and along the river of Sukhiye Yale along this red line, which will create another cauldron or another possible cauldron for the Ukrainians along this territory. Now let's move further, and we start receiving very important updates from the village of Kurakhove. The most important one was published also by pro-Ukraine neutral mappers, and according to them, the Russians managed to take under control this company stronghold. The biggest stronghold in the eastern part of Kurakhove currently is under complete Russian control, and as soon as Ukrainians lost control over the stronghold and were forced to fall back in the central part of the city, the Russians increased the pressure, and currently pro-Russian sources are saying that there are very heavy clashes in the eastern part. The Russians are moving and the Ukrainians are forced to fall back. So let's wait for additional geolocations. Most likely during the next few days we're going to receive first one, and we will adjust the map from contested area into the area of Russian control. Now let's move further and let's talk about the northern Kurakhove direction. We have a lot of changes on the ground that were confirmed by different geolocations. First, let's compare the map between the 9th and the 10th of November. This is the situation by the end of the 10th of November. The Russians just secured and finished the securing of Novodmytrivka. The Russians just reached the outskirts of the village of Sonsovka, and by the beginning of the 10th of November, the Russians managed not just to reach the outskirts of Sonsovka, but semicircle and to dig in deeper in the central part, in the central part of the northern part of the settlement. As you can see, we have a lot of geolocations, so let's discuss them in details. And the video was published by the pro-Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how the Ukrainian some maybe fighting vehicle was attacking the edge Russian positions, and the positions of Ukrainian vehicle was discovered exactly in this point, and the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian forces in this building. So we can change the angle of map. This will give us better understanding. So for example, this is exactly how we can see the map and how we can see the video. This is the building, and this is the building that was attacked, and this is the position of Ukrainian tank, and then the Ukrainian tank turned his tower to the right, and then the Ukrainians were bombing these positions. Based on this video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians control everything in the northeastern part of the settlement. The southern part, the northwestern part, most likely still remains under complete Ukrainian control. But there is one important statement, very important article that was published by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians also published a picture of this, of Sonsovka. They published the video of some pictures of different episodes of clashes on the territory of the settlement. And according to this, this video was published on Wednesday and Thursday, not today on Sunday or Saturday of the 9th and 10th of November. This video with Ukrainian vehicle was published on Wednesday or Thursday, which means that the Russians most likely since those days managed to improve their position significantly, and most likely the entire northern part of Sonsovka is already under Russian control, and Ukrainians were forced to retreat in the southern direction towards the farms. So this is most likely what is happening right now. Once again, let's compare the map. This is the situation by the end of the 9th of November, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 10th of November. The Russians managed to take under control the forest belts here. The Russians managed to take under control this forest, and the Russians managed to secure the northwestern part of Sonsovka. Obviously, the progress is insignificant, and the Russians are continuing moving further. Now let's talk about the Novoalexeyevka area. Today, the Ukrainians published the video of how they were after withdrawing the Russians in this part of the tree line, and based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Russia Russian favor. So the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian soldiers from the sabotage and reconnaissance group exactly in this point, and the map was adjusted. As for different mappers like pro-Ukrainians, according to them, the Russians managed to improve their positions even further in the western direction. Now let's compare the map. As you can see, we have adjusted the map significantly. This is the situation by the end of the 9th of November. This is the situation by the beginning of the 10th. The most important that from the territorial changes, we don't see anything. This territory used to be colored as contested area, but today we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. As for real changes on the ground, just a small advance along this tree line. Now let's talk about the village of Vishnyovo, Selidova direction. We have additional changes on the ground here as well, and these changes were confirmed both by the neutral mappers and pro-Ukrainian mappers. According to them, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to improve their positions and to take under control the village of Petrikovka for 50%, the southern part at least. Let's compare the map. This is the situation on the evening of the 9th of November. This is the situation by the morning of the 10th of November. The entire village was completely secured, according, once again, both neutral and pro-Ukrainian mappers. As you can see, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly, and the Kurakhove news is obviously tightening, and the Ukrainians most likely have no chances to hold their lines. The only thing they can do is to win the time, to win additional days, hours until the 20th of January, when Donald Trump is going to take his full power, and maybe then something is going to be changed. But once again, according to the statements that were made by BBC, Crimea is no more, and most likely Ukrainians shouldn't expect something big for them. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Toretsk direction, because during the previous 24 hours we also have additional changes on the ground. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing and attacking with FPV drone the Russian positions on the territory of mine. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. The Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians exactly in this point. This territory used to be considered as a contested area, but now we have enough of video, enough of geolocations to color this territory in Russian favor. I'd remind you that recently the Russians resumed their attempts to attack the Ukrainian forces on the territory of Toretsk. We start receiving lots of videos of how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking the Ukrainian forces. Most likely during the next few days we're going to receive additional updates. Also, the sources reported about increased Russian activity on the Chasiv Yar direction. We have very interesting article that was published by the Russians. The forces of the 20th Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces, the 98th Airborne Division, and the 1st Volunteer Corps of the Russian Armed Forces, the Vostok Brigade, the 88th Reconnaissance and Assault Brigade Española, and other units continued their offensive actions in the city of Chasiv Yar. Despite massive attacks on the Russian side, the Ukrainians entrenched in urban buildings and dug into private sector areas is putting up fierce resistance. So the Russians are attacking in 3 directions, and according to them, the Russians managed to take the village of Kalinovka completely, and the most important, the Russians managed to take under control these buildings and constructions on the territory of the forest. Furthermore, this is the area of responsibilities of the 20th Brigade. The forces of 88th Brigade are moving along the railways, and they reach the outskirts of the industrial zone that has the name of the Citadel. And the forces of 98th Brigade continue advancing in the central part of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians also along this line of combat contact managed to reach the southeastern part of the same citadel. So most likely during the next several days, the Russians may try to make their first attempt to consolidate their 3 group of forces and to attack the citadel from 3 directions with the purpose to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to defeat the Ukrainians completely. If Ukrainians lose the citadel, most likely they will lose everything around. As for the Sivers direction, nothing special. And for the Kupiansk direction, the same story. The only important statement we got is that Ukrainians, authorities on Kiev-controlled territories in the Kharkiv region, plan to carry out a full evacuation of the population in the Borovo district. Evacuation is also underway in the Kupiansk district, an area of active Russian advancement. So most likely this territory sooner or later will be cleaned up by the Ukrainians, and they will be able to start resisting to the Russian Russians in full strength. As for the Sudzha direction, the Russians continue it's already fourth day of Russian counter-offensive operation. And as for today, we have some changes in the northern part. We have some changes on the ground according to different mappers, and according to them, the Russians managed to secure the village of Pogrebki completely. This is the dynamic for the previous 3 or 4 days. The Russians, during the first day of attack, managed to take under control 3 villages. Then the Russians secured Pogrebki, Mariivka, at least the 50% of it. And then the Russians finished by the morning of the 10th of November to secure the village of Pogrebki completely. The northern artillery pocket is tightening and is becoming less and less. As for clashes, currently the main activity and the main clashes are taking place in the village of Darina. The Russians are trying to expand their foothold on the Ukrainian side of the river of Snaga, as the Ukrainians are showing the significant resistance and sending more and more troopers to counterattack the Russian forces. The Russians from their side are bombing and attacking the Ukrainians, trying not to allow them to concentrate the critical mass. Also, we have different statements about the North Koreans. Today, Syrsky reported that Ukraine's top military commander Alexander Syrsky said on Saturday that there were reports North Korean troops were preparing for combat alongside Russian forces. We have numerous reports of North Korean soldiers preparing to participate in combat operations alongside Russian forces. Syrsky wrote on Facebook of his conversation with Christopher Cavoli, a senior U.S. general who heads the U.S. European Command. Furthermore, as for this situation, just today, the Russians, Vladimir Putin, signed the law on ratification of the Treaty on the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with the DPRK. So just today, on the 11th of November, Vladimir Putin signed this document, which means that from now on, the Russians can call RDPK forces for a help, and they, according to this contract, according to this law, should come and to help the Russia alongside with the Russian army to fight with the Ukrainians. So most likely, the main activities in the Kursk direction are about to begin. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.